Welcome to an exclusive Byline Times panel, which explores the science, investigative journalism, and political decisions around the COVID-19 pandemic, with particular emphasis on the UK government led by Boris Johnson, partly because it was for many reasons an outlier in global responses, and because it looks set to have the highest coronavirus deaths toll in Europe. Now, for 6 weeks, Byline Times journalists, including several of our panelists here, have been exploring whether the UK has really been following the science, and indeed which science, and comparing it to other countries, the best practice in other countries such as New Zealand. And on that note, let me hand over to the other side of the globe, to Anita McNaught in New Zealand, who will introduce the panel and channel the discussion for the next hour or so. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. Yes, as Peter said, my name is Anita McNaught, and I'm bringing this panel to you in part from New Zealand. I myself am in Auckland. Professor Michael Baker, epidemiologist at the University of Otago, is coming to us, in fact, from Wellington. He's a member of New Zealand Ministry of Health's COVID-19 Technical Advisory Group, as well as being a practicing epidemiologist himself. Dr. Nafis Ahmed is in London, investigative journalist, Byline COVID-19 reporter, and the executive director of the Systems Shift Lab. Professor Anthony Costello, professor of global health, also in the United Kingdom, director of the maternal and child health department at the WHO until very recently. And last but not least, Dr. Rupert Reed, again in the UK, in Norwich, I believe. Rupert, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And who is an expert on the precautionary principle, in part because he is the associate professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He is also, you may recognize him as spokesman for Extinction Rebellion, so he's been very busy in recent years in the United Kingdom. So it turns out that almost any nation state you care to mention had actually war-gamed a pandemic in some shape or form, whether they called it influenza or whether they based it on experiences with SARS or Ebola. But few, perhaps no countries, especially in the Western world, had actually put their pandemic planning into any kind of really effective practice. And the question, I think, for all of you now is why? And why, in particular, the UK and the United States, who in some sense gave themselves political comfort that they had done everything that was necessary. They had been ranked as having excellent performance potential in the face of a disaster that we're now wrestling with, have ended up being the ones who have been most troubled by how to find a clear path through this. Professor Costello, your thoughts on this, and perhaps also your thoughts about whether the WHO, when it came to the crunch, and you've talked about their political constraints earlier, whether they gave the world the leadership it needed. But why has no one done what they knew they should have done?
Well, I think with regards to the UK and US, hubris, in a word, I think they felt that somehow they were untouchable. It's interesting that the 5 countries that have been really affected by the first SARS epidemic, which were China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and I think Canada, interestingly, all responded quickly because they'd had their fingers burned. We have been through 10 years of austerity programs where the whole watchword in both America and Britain is efficiency. And efficiency is at the expense of resilience. So if you've got the choice between large stockpiles of protective equipment, for example, or you just say, well, we'll have supply chains, why have great big stockpiles? Then that's one of the problems that you run into. And I think this has been a recurring theme, and it still is for the future, because our public health function has been very degraded in the UK. In 2013, it was moved into local authorities from the National Health Service, and it's been systematically cut for the last 6 years. So we've got a weak public health system, or a weakened one. We didn't have the kind of stockpiles we had a bit of hubris. We weren't really thinking this was going to come in our direction, even after seeing the calamity of Wuhan and indeed in Iran and Italy. So for all those reasons, I think we made a big mistake. And then to go on a policy where we say, well, let's just let it spread, was a huge mistake. Just on the WHO point, WHO is a member state organization, part of the UN. So they have to be diplomatic. They can't, it's not their job to start saying you were slow and all the rest of it, because they know they won't get into countries. And their budget, the total global WHO budget, is the same as my university in London. Okay. It's been systematically underfunded for the past 30 years since Reagan introduced a freeze on all assessed contributions. So each country pays a bit into WHO, but it's been systematically falling for the past 30 years. And I met, well, Tedros, Dr. Tedros, the person that Trump wants out right now, the Director General, he put out a call on February the 4th for $675 million to support the whole global effort, because they don't have any spare money there. And a month later, I was in Geneva, March the 4th, and I met Tedros and I said, how's it going with it? I hear that you've had about 120 million committed. He said, yeah, and do you know how much we've received? And I said, no. He said, $1.2 million. That's 6 weeks or 2 months into a massive pandemic that's going to cause trillions of dollars of damage to the world economy. That's the kind of atmosphere that you're in. And so they have to desperately keep people happy. He complimented President Xi Jinping, maybe too much. He complimented Donald Trump, even though he's had an even more calamitous management of his epidemic. So that's the real politique of the UN. It has very little power. It does have some soft power. But throughout this, and I'm not, listen, I've got my own criticisms of the way WHO works. But throughout this whole pandemic, every day they've said the same things and emphasized the importance of acting at speed and finding the virus to isolate it, and really clamping down on this. And they're still saying that and saying, don't give up on your containment measures when you aim to mitigate.
Professor Baker, you've touched already on New Zealand's awareness of what was happening in Asia. That's geographically inevitable, given New Zealand's location in the Pacific, looking north. But you also have the example of Australia, who, and not everyone may be aware of the subtleties of this, who locked down far less severely, placed far fewer restraints on its citizens than New Zealand did, and has arrived at an almost identical, if not better, outcome in the same time frame. So because of Jacinda Ardern's distinctive leadership, I think New Zealand has gained a lot of plaudits. Australia doesn't have quite the same assets there, you could say, and yet they did as well, if not better. Why is that? You must be particularly aware of what the differences are and how Australia managed to achieve what it achieved.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Basically, I think New Zealand did have to do what it did at that time because it was starting from a lower base in Australia. We had much less testing capacity to begin with, and we actually had a real shortage of test kits at that point. So we couldn't do as much testing as we wanted to. Australia actually was producing tests locally, so that was a real problem. So we had three reasons we went into this very intense lockdown. One was obviously it starts to extinguish those chains of transmission that were already starting in the community. Secondly, it gave us time to build up those critical capacities. That's border quarantine, contact tracing, and a lot of testing and surveillance. And thirdly, it basically was a very good way of showing the people of New Zealand what physical distancing was all about, because we hadn't been, no one alive has been through a pandemic like this before. We missed out, we didn't really experience SARS at all. And so I think the country needed to understand what the physical distancing and the travel restrictions And also it's quite an enforceable approach. They brought in the emergency powers under the Civil Defence Act, and people were essentially told, stay at home unless you've got a good reason to go and get healthcare or essential supplies, or you're an essential worker. And I think
but that bought New Zealand time to deal with some of its systemic deficiencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a giant bandage over the whole thing, essentially, a tourniquet almost. And I think we've come out of it actually in very good shape at this point. So the difference between that and unfortunately what I think most of the Western world is doing is that you're now in the purgatory of ongoing suppression, which may last for many months or even more than a year, just because of you've got widespread virus transmission. And when we say we're coming out of lockdown in New Zealand, it's completely different from the scenario in much of the Western world, because we're coming out very cautiously, hopefully, into a virus-free New Zealand. We accept there will be mistakes, and that's really what elimination means with other infectious agents. It doesn't mean...
Sorry to interrupt.
Please do. Please do.
I mean, let me just play devil's advocate. I imagine that Chris Whitty, the CMO, would say, look, this is a pandemic. We've got to judge it over the next 2 years. We may not have a vaccine. Is it also a Southern Hemisphere effect at the moment, that you're in a different season and that maybe that's going to come back with a vengeance, you know, in a few months' time, perhaps when it's quieter here? So I'm just trying to think what he would say. He might say, well, you know, you've still got the worst is yet to come.
Certainly. If we had evidence of widespread community infection, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are getting some dampening down. I mean, our effective reproduction number is a bit lower because it's summer, I agree. But unfortunately, with a new pandemic virus, the reproduction number is still very high, and essentially the entire population is susceptible. So there's no dampening down effect from having an immune portion, as you might see, obviously, with seasonal influenza. So, yes, I think there is a small effect from that. But the goal is, I mean, elimination is an ambitious goal. And at the moment, the evidence is there isn't any community transmission. But we think our government was probably a bit premature to say it's eliminated at this point. I think we're on the pathway to elimination. And as we're stepping down our alert levels, 3 and then 2 and hopefully 1, and people start getting back to school and work fully, we expect to see cases and outbreaks potentially. But the system now has capacity for very large contact tracing and quarantine. So we're very hopeful that capacity will fill the gap. And the other thing, of course, is there's virtually no one coming into New Zealand. It's just a trickle of people returning to New Zealand who have 2 weeks of supervised quarantine. So it's very different, I think, for island states, because you can manage your borders.
But I'm standing in an island state. This is the thing which is so ironic from the UK point of view. We look at Taiwan, we look at New Zealand, and then we're like, well, why couldn't we do that? It's especially ironic when you consider that the UK supposedly left the EU on January the 31st. And the reason why we left the EU is because many people in this country didn't like the levels of immigration we were having, and the government promised to do something about it and to regain control, take back control of our borders and so on. But apparently our borders are fine to be wide open to a deadly virus. I'd just like to quote, if I may, from the document that Ian Sinclair and myself published on the Byline Times, from this speech that the Prime Minister made straight after that on the 3rd of February, which really should be more widely known. It's quite incredible. He says, quote, "There is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage. At this moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange. Some country ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with a cloak flowing as a supercharged champion of the right of the populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other." In other words, the Prime Minister said at the start of February, we are going to be a nation that carries on trading even if it means we get this pandemic. You know, that right there is already the kind of smoking gun, it seems to me, to explain why there was so much credit given to this very dangerous policy of herd immunity in the following months. So it really comes back to the question that you asked me half an hour ago, Anita. It does seem as though, with incredible short-sightedness, the British government made the decision that they were going to try to prioritize the economy over suppression of this disease. And the evidence is right there, going back into early Feb.
Is there a consensus among the panel here that there is actually only one right way to get this virus under control, and that testing, tracking and tracing, the 3 T's that the World Health Organization underscored very early on in this issue, is actually the only way that any country is going to bring this situation under control?
Sorry, I would just say you could argue that's certainly what Korea did. You know, Korea did partial lockdowns in the 2 provinces out of 17 that they found it in, but they then did an aggressive testing program. And they developed their test on the same day as the UK in mid-January. But then they immediately went to pharmaceutical companies and said, we're going to need this test. And as soon as they'd had 3 deaths, they ramped up their testing. But they only did 66,000 in the first week and then ramped it up a bit more. And they had it all under control in 3 weeks. But you could argue Greece, they closed down the country when they just had a handful of cases. And the Prime Minister went on television and said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to protect you. They've had 120 deaths. Korea, which is 50 million, so 5 times bigger, 240 deaths. We're at 45,000 deaths, according to...
And we have a situation where the chief executive of Heathrow Airport in the last week has questioned the government policy to allow, what were the figures, 15,000 people a day still to fly into Britain's primary airport.
Yeah, no quarantine, nothing.
Is that something that strikes you as a missed opportunity?
Just on the, I mean, the traditional line is no travel bans because they don't work by and large. I mean, by the time that they would have had a travel ban in China, it had already spread to 17 countries, or if they'd gone earlier, it would have spread out to the other provinces. And so usually WHO, and most of the evidence is that this doesn't particularly work, but we're now in a situation in Britain, because it's gone rampant, even if our R0 value is going down below 1, we're still seeing 6,000 cases a day. So the actual volume of problem is still there. And we are going to have to introduce, as Rupert says, you know, the original aim was to avoid economic damage. We're going to have quite strict border quarantine controls. I mean, I don't know the number of people going into New Zealand, but the number of people coming into London to trade is very large. And yet we're probably going to have to limit our airports to 1 or 2 doing international. We're going to have to test them. We're going to have to get all their contact details and quarantine quite a lot of them coming back. Requisition hotels. I mean, the whole thing for a nation like the UK is going to be extremely difficult.
You're saying that's what the UK is going to have to do, but it's not what they're doing right now.
Exactly.
The irony is that you look at the decisions that the government have taken here in the UK, and the decisions have been about trying to keep the economy going and trying to reduce costs and disruption and all the rest of it. Certainly that's been a huge factor in the way the decisions have been made. And the irony is that what we're seeing is that as a result of doing that, the government has got itself into this position where down the line, they're going to be forced into a far more draconian state of affairs, which is going to do exactly what they originally wanted to avoid. You know, the whole idea was we're going to have this freedom of exchange and blah, blah, blah. And now we're at this point where we're looking at, you know, the government advisors saying we might have an 18-month lockdown, intermittent suppression, you know, kind of so marginal restriction lifting here and there, and then, you know, kind of locking back down again, and, you know, going on indefinitely until we have a vaccine, which is a kind of a horrifying dystopian nightmare scenario. And, you know, we're looking at New Zealand and Australia and other countries in Asia. And we're thinking, how did this happen? You know, this is not in any way, shape or form helpful for the economy. And yet this is exactly what we've ended up as a result of this ideology, you know, and this kind of austerity driven decision making. We've ended up in this scenario doing exactly what we set out not to do. And I think what this really says to me is that this whole approach of kind of favoring the economy over human life is a fundamentally flawed and mistaken approach. It doesn't make any sense. But all the decisions that we've made are resulting in the collapse of these very critical systems. You know, by collapsing our healthcare system in this way, we're creating these ramifying impacts across our economy. You cannot separate out the economy from a strong public health system which protects life. And I think that's the huge lesson that this government really needs to take away, is that you're not going to have prosperity without that. I think the question then that arises is, is there a way, having got ourselves into this mess, is there a way to get out of this scenario, which is, still going to be difficult, but is there a way to get out which is not necessarily the same thing as a pure 18-month lockdown? And I think one of the things that I've heard from Michael and Anthony, which is really intriguing to me, is it possible, if we ramp up this approach that we're seeing that has worked elsewhere, is it too late for us to ramp up that approach? Or if we do that now, can we begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel come a bit closer?
I don't think we have an alternative, because the thing about find, test, trace, isolate is it's the most effective form of social or physical distancing, because what you're doing is locating the people that really have the virus and locking them down. And as the Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Romer has shown very elegantly, and with, he can do the maths, but he does it as an animation. If you do that and lock down people, you can get your economy going again, because you're locking down, let's say, 10% of the population who are cases, controls, and doing it very efficiently. And the other 80, 90% of the population could get back to work. But you have to have a sort of social contract then, that if you become a contact, you agree to do this, and you have to quarantine properly, which would be 14 days. But the problem is the British government is not really getting to grips with this. They still seem to think they can just manage it by spreading it out and not really getting an integrated national program to lock the virus down, which is what the Asian states have done.
Let's throw an outlier into this, and it is Sweden, because all eyes have been slightly on Sweden as the interesting differential in this European equation. Everyone understands they're following a different policy. The Swedish epidemiologists at the heart of their own country's strategy have talked about being happy that the UK at one point was in step with Swedish policy and then took a U-turn after the Imperial College report. Do we think that Sweden is going to be able to produce evidence of a third way? Or is there something about Sweden that can't be replicated anywhere else? So it might be interesting, but not an example like Asia that other countries who've found their strategies at the moment aren't working can ultimately follow.
Well, Swedish cases are still going up, right? There's no solid evidence yet that their approach is really working, certainly if you compare it to the other Nordic countries.
The death rate in Sweden is 6 times what it is in Norway.
Yeah.
And substantially higher than Finland and Denmark. So it hasn't worked on those grounds. And as Rupert says, cases are going up as well. So, and there is some backtracking. And of course, they have had some social distancing because, much milder than here. And it's a smaller country, but let's wait and see with Sweden.
Also, a physically bigger country, maybe a bit easier to keep spread out from each other.
Yes,
well, comparing them to the other Nordic countries who locked down early may not be so helpful. If Sweden practiced a sort of Swedish version of laissez-faire, its death rates are far below anything experienced by the parts of Europe that are more south.
But the Stockholm death rates are now approaching New York City's death rates.
Really?
Yeah, apparently.
Mm.
Well,
I
I
mean, you know the Swedish epidemiologists at the centre of their strategy. They're old colleagues of yours. Have you talked to them since this all kicked off? And do you have any insights into why Sweden has taken the course it has? Do you think Sweden, in a different way to Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore, has something to teach the world?
Yeah, I mean, we're all very interested in what they're doing, and I know Johan Giesecke very well, who was a former state epidemiologist, and I have talked with them about what they're doing, and they had a very coherent, well worked out rationale. There was one element that I think that New Zealand was looking at. This was before we were really aware that it was a distinct approach, but this is a huge emphasis on protecting the vulnerable. And quite often, I mean, when we were thinking, oh, this is going to be like pandemic influenza, it's going to wash over the country, you can't contain it. This is in February, we thought, well, let's have a huge emphasis on protecting vulnerable people. And we talked about in New Zealand a safe havens approach, where there's even the potential for some people to shift to parts of the country. And New Zealand does have a history, even in 1918, where some communities actually put up roadblocks and protected whole regions of the country. And I understand Iceland has a similar approach, where they actually had the spots where they put in the roadblocks preordained. I don't know actually how that's unfolded for them, but that is an element that I think the Swedes had really articulated and we thought was quite useful about protecting vulnerable groups. I think as it's rolled out, of course, we realized, in fact, this was a virus that could be contained. So then, if you like, I think there's almost two forks in the road. The first fork is, can you keep it out? And can you contain it and eliminate it? And if you decide you can, then I think that's vastly preferable to the alternatives. If you're then at the point where the pandemic's going to wash over you, you're then on that spectrum from obviously suppression to mitigations. Everywhere is somewhere along that line. And I guess you have to decide what the most effective is. And the Swedes, as I understand, have said, well, only time will tell. It will be in a year or two when you look back and you look at the harm done by the pandemic, the harm done by the economic disruption of the response, and you put it all together to work out what was the net best outcome for your people. And I think that's quite complex. Also, it might be the Swedish approach obviously may not be translatable to other countries in Europe. And I think they also concede that the implementation has been difficult. They've had severe outbreaks in their very large care facilities for the older Swedish population. So it's partly a problem of implementation. But my impression at a distance was that in the UK, that model could not work. In fact, it was clearly shown to be a disaster by the modelling done by Imperial College, and we followed that very closely. It's interesting, even in New Zealand, even when containment was working, we still had a group in New Zealand who was saying, no, we must follow Sweden, we must let the virus in, and that's the only way. And of course, fortunately, their views have become a much quieter voice, and in fact have almost gone now in New Zealand. But it was interesting, we were watching very huge attention to how this was playing out in other countries.
Well, I actually interviewed a senior doctor in Sweden who, on condition of anonymity, who basically wanted to kind of blow the whistle on some of the things she was seeing. And she basically, I mean, the thrust of what she said to me is that she was really concerned, and some of her other colleagues, she's an epidemiologist, were very concerned about the dishonesty of the public health authority there, which has actually been, and it's an interesting situation, very different to a country like the UK, where there seems to be some confused and interference between the political class, political decision makers, and the scientists, and it's not clear who's driving the decision making. But she told me that actually it's the scientists at the public health authority who are driving the decisions. But she said that what was happening is they're actually releasing lots of strange information. So she described how they were talking about herd immunity, and they were giving out estimates, and they had actually published a whole study talking about how they think this very significant percentage of the Swedish population had already developed herd immunity, and they were well on their way to getting past this. And I think literally within the hour, they had to retract the document that apparently had been informing their strategy for many weeks, because it was just riddled with huge and elementary errors that scientists and other people had pointed out almost straight away. So it does sound like I mean, this was only one interview with one particular individual, but it does sound this person didn't have any particular axe to grind. They were just essentially a public health expert who was very concerned. It does sound to me like there is some confusion going on at Swedish level. But I asked her if there is this strange kind of, maybe this contempt for evidence at some level, and then kind of manipulation of evidence, why? Why is that happening? And she just couldn't answer. She says she doesn't know. She wants to get to the bottom of it. She doesn't understand what's driving the policy. But as far as she was concerned, it wasn't really evidence-based.
And of course, it's all based on the assumption that you're going to get herd immunity. And there's very little evidence for that now. I mean, firstly, the tests are not specific enough. So a lot of the positives that we're hearing about in surveys could easily be false positives, where it looks like you've got antibodies to COVID-19, but actually it's antibodies to other coronaviruses or something else. I mean, in Singapore, they had a test 2 months ago, but it cross-reacted with dengue fever. And then the other thing is that antibodies may be part of the problem, that actually the reason that this illness deteriorates in the second week is that as some antibody response come up, which may not be protective, it actually facilitates getting the virus into cells, which then causes the cytokine storm, which causes all of the problems in your lungs and kills. And we know that in children as well, we're now seeing quite a lot of cases, well, not a lot, but small number of cases in many countries where children are getting toxic shock syndromes, again, probably related to this. And like in dengue fever, you get this immune enhancement effect, whereby if you have it once and then get it again next year, you actually get it more severely because of some interaction with the antibody response, which is not necessarily protective. And we also know that very mild cases or asymptomatics don't mount an antibody response, it seems. So all the evidence points to this being actually a bit of a myth. So then you have, well, why didn't you adopt the precautionary principle? Because the only reason to let it rip, and I don't know many other viruses we've ever done that for, is on the assumption that herd immunity will solve it and it's not going to be too bad. Neither of those presumptions were true.
Before we move on to how, as a planet, we coexist with this virus, and how, as various nations, we get out of the economic and social lockdown pickles that we're in, I want to ask all of you where we feel we're at with the Imperial College report that, in a sense, was so pivotal for so many policies of so many governments. When that came out, for example, it seemed to have had a salutary effect on the UK government and took them from a stance of comparative complacency to one of action. Do we still feel the Imperial College report's figures stand up? And of course, they had a range. The headlines were generated by the extreme range, but their predictions, their modelling, as it stands, do we still feel that they had the best view of how this could play out?
Well, can I start on that and just make a couple of quick points? First point is to go back to what Nafiz said much earlier, which is that the kind of figures that the Imperial study came out with were very similar to the obvious back of the envelope figures that we'd been dealing with 2-3 weeks earlier, when many of us had been already begging the government in the UK to move, because their own information was already saying we could have 500,000 or 1 million people being killed by this. So I think we should be wary of overstating the importance of the Imperial study. My take is that the reason why the Imperial study gets mentioned so much is that it came at a convenient moment for the UK to start to justify its change of policy and to pretend that, as they put it, the science had changed, when actually it was basically in line with what people had been saying for weeks before that. And the other initial point I'd like to make is to connect directly with what Anthony was saying just now, which was music to my ears. The piece that Nafees and I published recently in the Byline Times was about how the British government's own policy documents state very clearly, in a case like this, you should follow the precautionary principle. It's necessary to do so in the public health sphere. And the less you know about a disease and the more the potential downside of this disease is extreme, the more important it is to follow the precautionary principle and to move and to keep ahead of the science and to keep ahead of the evidence, to keep ahead of the virus. This is especially so in an era of globalization and mass travel. Remember when we had the Spanish flu, it traveled at the speed of sailboats and so forth, yeah? This virus traveled at the speed of jet planes. We had to be ready to move fast to suppress it, or if possible to eliminate it. You only get one shot with something like this to prevent a global pandemic or to prevent a deadly epidemic in your own country. And it is deeply depressing and deeply distressing. It's something that we have to learn from. We absolutely have to learn from in relation to pandemics and also in relation to other potentially existential threats, that the precautionary principle was not applied by countries like the UK and the US.
Professor Baker, I see you nodding broadly during what Rupert is saying. A failure of risk assessment then?
Yeah, well, I think other people have described the response of the West as this complacent exceptionalism, that somehow what was happening in Asia wouldn't hurt us, and the West was somehow were protected. But I remember early on, just doing the back of the envelope calculation you talk about, this was clearly a virus that could kill, 0.5% of the world's population, 30 million people. If you just did the very basic maths of something with this reproduction number, means that automatically if it's 2.5, it's about 60% of the world's population over 1 to 2 years. What we knew about the case fatality rate and the infection mortality rate would suggest it was tens of millions of people going to die. Applying that to any country, it looked very grim if you couldn't basically exclude the virus and contain it. And there seemed to be that window of opportunity in February when it was containable. And the Chinese had achieved it. They'd achieved a miracle. And I remember seeing that report on the WHO website of the joint mission to China, showing with very credible people went in and found that the Chinese had done this thing that was quite remarkable. And so every country in the world could follow that model if it chose to. And it seems strange that it didn't. And sitting down in New Zealand, we were waiting for the lead from the places we always look to, which is the West, CDC and the UK and Europe, saying, yeah, we're rolling out all of these measures to contain this infection, and nothing happened. And it did leave us, in fact, a small number of us who were saying, actually, we need to act, feeling very exposed because we couldn't see the normal source of information and wisdom were not backing us up about a vigorous response. And so I think a lot of the world was looking for a lead from the West. And in the end, we went and looked at the examples from Asia instead, and just in the nick of time, I think, for Australia and New Zealand.
Just one question, because if you look at the composition of our scientific advisory group of experts, I mean, you want it to be open, independent, diverse. It was leaked this week, and I'm not going to name names, but 13 of the 23 were government employees, so they weren't independent. I mean, their bosses were sitting in the same room, and the most powerful lieutenant to the prime minister. So that was not, you could discount a lot of that because they're not giving you independent advice. But, it was worse. That the most striking thing for me was there was not a single public health person. I mean, the most fundamental thing is to have 2 or 3 independent public health people saying, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to think? You don't have 7 mathematical modelers because they're putting in assumptions. They don't know anything about the health. We didn't have that. We didn't have an international person. Why didn't we have Gabriel Leung from Hong Kong, or some of the Chinese scientists, or even someone from Korea? We just didn't do that. It was a fundamental weakness, I think, in how we responded.
No one from Italy and no one who is an expert on the precautionary principle. I mean, one could go on and on about the
exactly.
Stage.
All right, so the UK is where it is. How does the UK get out of lockdown? It's got its 5 tests. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is talking about a roadmap. It's a useful word at a time like this. He hasn't actually said what it is, as so often happens with roadmaps. How does, realistically, from what we've learned internationally, from the examples we've seen in Taiwan, Korea, China, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, how is the UK best placed to get out of the situation it's in? Is there a way out?
Let me start again by making just a very obvious remark, going back to what we said earlier. If the lockdowns had a positive effect in the UK, and it's obvious that it has, then we're going to get to the situation sometime in the next few weeks where we've got very little community transmission going on here. We absolutely must secure our borders. It would be completely absurd to have a relatively successful lockdown and continue to let people in with not even proper temperature testing, let alone quarantine or anything else at our borders. It's obvious that this is part of the way that countries like New Zealand have succeeded, that they are doing what they can do well domestically and then stopping reinfection coming from abroad. So there's some just really basic things like that that the government have to get serious about. And if they don't get serious about it before they unlock the lockdown, then the whole thing will in some sense have been pointless.
Any thoughts, Professor Baker?
Well, yeah, I think extending that idea, I mean, this is the old cordon sanitaire approach, isn't it? Where you put a ring around a discrete population. I mean, China did this. You basically suppress the virus very intensely for a period, and then you have the contact, the case identification, a lot of testing, contact tracing, quarantine, and you gradually, snub it out over a period of time. I mean, theoretically, it's possible. China did it. It's just whether the population has the willingness to go through that, what would be a very intense process, and whether there's the confidence in government and health authorities to do that. I don't know. I mean, theoretically, of course, it can be done, but practically, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Well, I don't think the policy has really changed. First of all, their 5 criteria are not the same as the WHO's 6 criteria. They're very different. They're saying, well, get the deaths down so that they're coming down and that cases are at a manageable level. Well, what does that mean? And if we lift this lockdown too early, I mean, given that we're still a long way off what we should be doing to really get this tightly under control, and if we were going to put in place a proper integrated find, test, trace, isolate policy, as well as social distancing, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to then have the option that then it will start coming back again, and then they'll have to have, as Nafis was saying, a scenario of repeated cycle of lockdowns. But that's going to be hugely economically damaging, and it may not be complied with. So I think we're in quite a mess. But I don't think we'll get a surge back like we've had. I think it will, because I think most people will preserve a measure of social distancing. I think we've already set that off, but I think it's going to be a very unstable time for the next few months. I just hope we get the vaccine, but then the government's going to face the problem if we do get a vaccine by the end of the year, which some of the labs are talking optimistically about. Then people are going to turn around and say, well, why did 45,000 people die, or 60,000 as it might be by then? Because they didn't need to.
In terms of the willingness of the population to physically distance, I think it's also worth our remembering. We were talking earlier about the so-called behavioral science and them saying, well, you mustn't lock down too early because people won't be willing to go along with it. What we actually saw in February and March was a larger and larger crescendo of people in Britain saying, for God's sake, do something, please. You know, we want you to put in these measures. And people doing it themselves spontaneously. And many, many of us going into isolation or cancelling events, you know, so many people and organizations spontaneously moving ahead of the government in so many ways, completely contradicting what the behavioral scientists were assuming. So maybe there's some grounds for optimism there, especially given that the lockdown has been reasonably well complied with in this country as well once it was brought in by the government. Maybe there's some reason for optimism that actually the British people are up for taking this pretty seriously, especially if they get any kind of real lead from the government.
Notwithstanding everything that has gone on before and the amount of suffering, and let's acknowledge it, that has been sustained by the populations of countries like Britain, is it still an option for the United Kingdom to clamp down even harder and finally get to grips with this virus? Who wants to deal with that?
Well, I can comment. At a distance, given that the UK is having to cope with very intense periods of lockdown, why don't you go to the next step and actually aim for a control or even an elimination strategy and systematically working through the country to eliminate the virus? Because you've got all the techniques available to you that other countries have. China has shown it's possible. Why isn't the UK following that same trajectory? Why aren't you, hoping or having an ambitious dream to get rid of the virus entirely? Because it seems very doable.
As an island state, particularly, has advantages.
Yeah, given that the alternative is, what the alternative is, which is a kind of purgatory of a year or more of alternating periods of lockdown, why don't you actually say, let's do this once, do it really well, and come out the other side in a relatively virus-free country, and then it's a mopping up operation with case identification, contact tracing, quarantine, all those methods that we know are working elsewhere in the world.
Dr. Rupert Read, this also comes down, doesn't it, to that concept of political will and that other concept of political leadership. If that were the course that would be the most sensible one for the United Kingdom to pursue, do you see it in its current structure as politically feasible?
Well, something which is, again, I'm afraid being a little depressing about the situation here in Britain is that as far as I'm concerned, we haven't had enough political opposition to what the government has been doing. The whole political class, it seems to me, pretty much, with very few exceptions. Exceptions might be Rory Stewart, Molly Scott-Cato and Caroline Lucas in the Greens. More or less the whole British political class has failed to consider the kind of possibility, really, that Michael just described. It's been left to people like Piers Morgan to stand up for the intelligent point of view of the person who actually wants to get serious about suppressing or eliminating this virus. So it's going to be very difficult. But as Michael says, it's entirely possible, and we are an island state. It should be easier for us than for many. I think there will come a time when the consensus will move in this kind of direction because the alternatives are just so poor.
Yeah, I would say at this point, really, the question is the government going to begin following the best scientific advice that we have and begin really taking seriously the models that have actually shown that there is a way to control this and to kind of, return your society to some normality. And I think that's the key here. If the government refuses to basically kind of eat a bit of humble pie and say, okay, we're gonna really ramp up mass testing, we're going to really go for this, tracing and isolation policy. If they refuse to do that, we are in for a long haul, and it's not clear what the answer will be. But that's like it's a lose-lose scenario. So my hope is that at some point the government really begins to listen to the experts, the real experts, and says, let's actually take this on properly. And if they do that, looking at that, we may have got ourselves into a bit of a huge mess. And we've certainly caused far more damage, and there has been this preventable loss of life. But it's not too late necessarily to rein it in and ensure that we kind of don't continue on this horrifying path. And maybe it will take, as a result, slightly longer than other countries to pull it back. But it's not completely. I don't think anybody none of the experts I've spoken to, and certainly not you guys, have suggested that it's impossible. It's certainly, even now, if we do the right things, it's not too late to really to get some control. In fact, really, it's the only way to do that. So I think that's the message that I would like policymakers to begin taking seriously, that there is a way out, but you really need to start taking those measures that public health experts who know what they're talking about are saying, and then we can actually look to the future.
Gentlemen, I think that's as good a point as any to conclude this discussion. We had hoped to talk about what kind of world we will step into when this is all done with, but I think the message very clearly from all of you is it's not even remotely done with yet, and even countries like New Zealand, who have come close to elimination, still have to function as trading nations in a diseased world. So we are all interconnected in this, and we have all been interconnected for this discussion, for which I am extremely grateful. Thank you so much for talking today with each other on this.